everyone, I'm Charna Davis Wiese and welcome to UCF in Print. Our guest today has so many interests and is so versed in so many different things that we're just going to get straight into it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Carpenter. We are talking about hundreds of years of music, culture, and literature.
I think so.
For everything from late 16th, early 17th century England, all the way through contemporary jazz. How did you find such diverse styles and genres to focus on?
Well, that's a pretty difficult question, actually, but I started playing blues guitar when I was young and got interested in all different kinds of music. Then I played as a professional guitarist for years, and I went back later and got a PhD in English literature and Renaissance literature, specifically focused on Shakespeare. So when I did that, it just seemed natural to start learning about that history of music and the way that instruments were used in the theater and the cultural meanings behind the music in Shakespeare's theater.
So what you did is you really took a new passion and mixed it together with your old.
There you go.
You melded them both together. I guess we'll start in the beginning, the period of time in history that you focus on. You know, until I was getting ready and researching for this meeting with you, I had forgotten. You know, you take that history years ago in school, and I had forgotten the profound changes going on in the world at that time. Changes not only in the political situations and cultural mores that were incredibly momentous.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that starts the whole change in art and literature and music and drama.
It starts in a whole change in art and literature and drama. It also starts in changing ways of looking at that, ways of looking at the art and drama and literature. It was a time when there was a big shift in culture from feudalism on to what we now call capitalism, and that's of course an oversimplification, but a lot of people would say that Shakespeare was one of the first capitalists. He charged money for people to come see his theater, and of course there were musicians working within that theater. And in fact, right now I'm writing about the trumpeters. There were trumpeters that played in Shakespeare's theater, and there were trumpeters that played in Elizabeth's court and King James' court. And historically, the trumpeters had been called signalers. They played little sequences of notes, like a bugle call, in the court when someone was coming, or in the military when there was going to be some kind of meeting between military people. The trumpeter would play what's called a parley. Well, Shakespeare and the other playwrights of his time, we don't know what those things sounded like, but they kept all the words for them. So you'll be reading a Shakespeare play and there's a stage direction for a tucket or a synod or a parley, and that means that this trumpet player I'm writing about has to play some specific sequence of notes that then mean something to the audience. And I find that fascinating. The whole idea of music meaning something is fascinating to me, of music as a kind of language. I mean, certainly, technically it's not a language, but it can certainly signify some specific things. Meanings
and emotions, and it stirs feelings in us.
Yes, it does.
But this is one of the first times it was actually used to create them.
Well, perhaps. It's hard to say, but it was certainly used for that. And so what I'm looking at are the ways in which, if a trumpeter is playing a specific, there was one called the tucket. Trumpeter's playing a tucket because Othello's coming onto the stage. What did that mean for the audience? What did it sound like? What did it tell us about Othello? Of course, we don't have scores for any of that music. We don't have, there were tuckets used in the theater for a long time, and we don't have any of those traditional tuckets. So when I teach this material, I ask the class what they think Othello sounds like. And sometimes I'll bring a guitar synthesizer into class and I'll make different sounds. First I'll play something that I know Othello doesn't sound like a saxophone patch that sounds like Charlie Parker, and then we can laugh and say, well, Othello doesn't sound like that, but what does Othello sound like? This leads to a whole conversation, Charna, about how you ever can get to an original performance of Shakespeare. because we've lost so many of the conventions, the musical conventions, but of course also all kinds of conventions that went along with those performances. So when a trumpet player plays a tucket for Shakespeare's audience, they will have heard that trumpet player play tuckets time and time before that. And it might be something from a popular song. Maybe it's from a street ballad about strange and monstrous fish, or the birth of an ugly baby that was circulating at that time, something else I like to write about. And then that makes the audience respond, and maybe they laugh. Maybe it's incongruent with who this person is. Maybe they take somebody from the court who has this trumpet sound associated with them, and they play it for an evil character who walks on the stage, and then that's really funny. All that's lost on us. It's completely lost.
Because in those times, there was no way, there were no radio stations.
No radio stations.
Unless you were there in the audience, you really couldn't convey that to somebody else.
Exactly.
And also, they really couldn't make fun of someone in the court without doing it in some allegorical or satirical way, could they?
That's for sure.
So what do your students say? Do they come up with the same kind of ideas? It shows you that maybe it's all so individual when they
absolutely.
think of what the sound must be like.
Oh, we do all kinds of things. One way is to start experimenting with the sounds themselves and say, okay, what does the sound make you feel? Of course, then we can talk about how culturally charged that is. Even the idea of a major key being happy or a minor key being sad is a culturally charged idea. So it leaves us talking about how we then do something credible with the music in a Shakespeare performance. And it also leaves us talking about films like Romeo plus Juliet that then has this pop music soundtrack. And I say something like, okay, well, say we're not going to try to recreate the original performance. Say instead we're going to try to put together some kind of performance that speaks to our audience. And our audience is people your age. So maybe you could think of a band or a song that sounds like who Othello is to you, and then support that with lines from the play so that we can make sense out of that. And we get to some pretty interesting things. I had someone suggest that the introduction from Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze would be a good introduction for Othello when he comes on, because it has what's called the tritone, which is culturally charged, but we know from writings that it was culturally charged in Shakespeare's time. It was called the devil's interval or something, and you just don't play that. So it's a scary sound, perhaps, for us and for them. And then we talk about the fact that, just as I talked about, if a trumpeter were to play a snippet of a song that was a song about a strange and monstrous fish or the birth of an ugly baby, then the audience would laugh. What happens if we play the introduction to that Jimi Hendrix song when Othello comes on the stage? The rest of the song then plays in the audience's mind, and they're thinking, oh, purple haze all through my brain. Lately things just don't seem the same, acting funny and I don't know why. So there's these ideas of confusion and etc. So you see where I'm going. You can use music in all kinds of ways then to stimulate the audience.
Sophia Coppola tried that in Marie Antoinette, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
I'm not a movie critic, but I don't think it worked.
Probably not, but Julie Taymor in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus did some really interesting things with music that way, down to associating different genres or periods of music, like 40s music with some characters, and then these other characters were like MTV music of the 80s, and that worked pretty well.
And you know, when you say that, you see that happen in a lot of film, like in Woody Allen when he used period music or the standards, and it does give you a dichotomy and get you thinking about other things. It's
absolutely. True. The other thing that I write about beyond the trumpeters and the sounds on the stage themselves has to do with those ballads that I've mentioned. And they're pretty interesting, I think. There were street ballads that were sung on street corners by ballad hawkers. And they would have these broadsides, a big piece of paper, and it's printed on one side with the words to a song, and usually there would be a woodblock print at the top, some kind of picture. Of course, the pictures were used over and over again, so they may or may not really have something to do with what's going on in the ballad itself. And then, because a lot of the people who would buy the ballads couldn't read music notation, it would say at the top, sung to the tune of so-and-so. So lots of them were sung to the tune of Greensleeves and songs like that that we know about. So you could buy these songs, and I'm serious, there are so many songs about the births of ugly babies, you wouldn't believe it. So I kind of think of these things as the National Enquirer of their time. People would then sing these, and can you imagine sitting around with your family and singing a song about the birth of a strange and ugly baby? I'm not sure.
Like those tabloids in the supermarket, Bat Boy or something.
Right, exactly. That's what it makes me think of. And then there are various subgenres of ballad, and there was one about, I keep mentioning these, fish.
That really is we've got to talk about more. Okay. It sounds so interesting, but we'll be right back in about a minute. We're talking with John Carpenter, and we're just touching on one of his many interests, is interesting music from the past, very far away, 17th century England. And you're talking about fish ballads.
Yes, ballads of strange and monstrous fish. And there's a formula to these ballads. There's even a formula to the title of the ballads. The title has to say, usually it says strange and monstrous, the discovery or the capture of a strange and monstrous fish. And then it says where the fish was captured, by whom the fish was captured, how big the fish was. And then there'll be all of this hyperbole in the ballad itself about just how monstrous this fish was. Again, oh, let's sit around and sing that ballad, dear, about the strange and monstrous fish.
We're finished about singing about the ugly baby. Right. But those two keep repeating themselves over and over again.
They do keep repeating themselves, and I just finished writing an article. Again, I'm interested in, when people went to a Shakespeare play, I'm interested in what they were thinking about. They probably walked by somebody singing a song about a ugly baby on the way into the theater.
Being eaten by a strange and monstrous
Being eaten by a strange and monstrous fish. So I wrote about this Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, that has a character named Caliban in it. Now, Caliban is described as half monster, half man, but he's also described as a fish, as a monstrous fish. So I took some of these street ballads with some of the things that they say about fish, and I tried to apply them to Caliban. And it's kind of interesting, because I think that again, there's these class associations. There's certain kinds of people who might sing a ballad in a play, and then there's other kinds of people who probably wouldn't want to be associated. I have this piece. It's in a book called Essays by Sir Thomas Cornwallis, where notice the Sir, so that tells us a lot about Sir Thomas Cornwallis. Sir Thomas Cornwallis talks about ballad singers. Oh, I've seen them in the street, but then he talks about how you don't want to stand too close to them because you don't want to be associated with the ballad singer, and you don't want to be associated with the people that he's singing to. And then he goes on to say that he takes the ballad broadsides into his privy, where they can be put to a better use, he says. So this is what the upper classes thought of these ballads, or at least wanted us to think they thought about the ballads. They probably sang them, but I find that fascinating.
Well, in those days, there was probably not very much entertainment.
Well, I guess your definition of entertainment would probably be different than it is now, especially if you were singing these street ballads on the corner.
It might be a lot of fun to them. The interesting thing about Shakespeare is how many different things he did. Not only did he incorporate the trumpeters, he also had villainous, despicable characters doing despicable things, but you had sympathy for them. He made them humans, and
Certainly.
he mixed all of this all together, probably the first time.
Oh, well,
that
again,
we know of.
That we know of. Who knows? But I like what you say there. He certainly does provide a human side to a lot of his characters, and even the ones that you really don't like, you find a way in. I guess Richard III is the famous one of those, isn't he? Especially if you've ever seen Pacino's Looking for Richard, he talks about that a lot.
No, I didn't.
Oh, it's
but
worth,
I'll have to put it on my
It's worth a look. It's getting away from music, but just briefly, there's this wonderful scene in Richard III where there's a woman whose husband and father have been killed by Richard III. Her husband's dead body is in a coffin right there, talk about a prop, and then Richard III, who killed the guy in the coffin, is coming on to her, and he gets away with it. She actually agrees to meet with him. Talk about weird sympathies for a character.
That's an amazing touch to be able to do. He must have been something else as a person, you know?
He must have been something else as a person.
And there's all kinds of questions about so many different things about him, his religion, his sexuality, so much to question today.
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to get into the whole thing about, especially about who he was.
Shakespeare is very complex, but in terms of what he did, incorporating music and everything, to somehow make a transition, what you are doing with Kwame Dawes is integrating literature and music and art. And for people who may not be familiar with, very famous man who has written and plays and is there anything he hasn't done with
I
the
don't
written
think
word?
so. Kwame
He acted
Dawes.
it, he directed it, he wrote them.
He sang them. He's amazing. He's an amazing guy. But I'll say a few things about
Did you meet him at university?
I met him at the University of South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Actually, the day I went to look at the university to try to decide where I was going to go get my PhD, I met Kwame Dawes. And
that would be enough.
He had a lot to do with it. What an amazing human being.
Totally.
Born in Ghana, raised in Jamaica. His father was Neville Dawes, one of the fathers of Caribbean literature, really. Kwame then moved, his father was originally from Jamaica and then had moved to Ghana. So the family moved back to Jamaica, where Kwame grew up at the time when reggae music was really starting to blossom. And that changed his life. He's written tons of material about reggae. Reggae finds its way into the plays. He's written a book about Bob Marley called Lyrical Genius. It's not biased at all. Marley is called Lyrical Genius. And more importantly, I think, he's written a book called Natural Mysticism, toward a reggae aesthetic, in which he tries to voice a cultural center for Jamaica in terms of an aesthetic, and claim that it comes from reggae, but then can be translated into literature and the other arts, and that Jamaican cultural identity is all about reggae. It all centers on reggae.
And the piece you're doing with him, Requiem, really started with artwork based on Middle Passage.
Yes.
And then he wrote about it, and now you're putting the music to it. So it's a real multi-dimensional cultural artistic experience.
Absolutely. Tom Feelings, the artist, who was a wonderful artist. He worked with Maya Angelou on a couple of books and did a lot of interesting things. But he moved from New York City to Ghana, I believe, in the early 60s. And then he spent 20 years doing paintings of the Middle Passage. He saw where some of the slaves were shipped from Africa and the Middle Passage, or of course the passage of the slaves to the New World, and including, of course, the Caribbean islands. And he did amazing, they're charcoal drawings for the most part, all in black and white. Unbelievably powerful stuff. He put those together into a book when he came back. It was called Middle Passage, colon, has to be a colon in there if it's an academic title, middle passage, colon, white ships, black cargo. Kwame Dawes saw the book, started to write Tom a thank you letter for putting those paintings together, and of course Kwame being Kwame, it turned into another book of poetry that he called Requiem. I saw Tom's book and the book Requiem in Kwame Dawes' office, and he picks up the book and throws it at me and says, go home and read that and see if it makes you feel like writing any music. So I did, and I wrote a bunch. That first night, came back into Kwame's office, played it for him.
He probably couldn't believe it. It's the next day you've written it already.
He knew me.
He knows you.
He knew me.
He expected it. What took you so long?
Right, exactly. But it worked, and we performed. This is like 4 and 5 years ago. We performed at a lot of universities around the country. We performed in some art museums. We performed in a Baptist church in rural North Carolina. It was amazing. And every place we performed, again, we had PowerPoint slides of Tom's paintings, and then I write music based on specific poems. And Kwame would read the poem, and I would improvise while he's reading the poem, and then I would play after that the song that I wrote, which is all instrumental, and the styles vary. I tried to write music that was as much about Kwame Dawes and Tom Feelings as it was about Kwame Dawes' poetry and Tom Feelings' art. Tom Feelings was into John Coltrane era jazz, and that into that kind of out there electric stuff, including Jimi Hendrix. So that finds its way in there. A lot of free jazz stuff can find its way in there. Sun Ra, that kind of stuff.
So is it not the same twice? Every time you play it?
Oh, there are set parts.
So much jazz is improvisation.
There are set written parts of every song, but then every song has places for improvisation as well.
So you do that on the guitar?
I do it in different ways depending on the situation. I have it all charted out for a 7-piece band, and I've done it that way. And then sometimes I do it just solo guitar. But when I do it on solo guitar, I bring a guitar synthesizer in so that I can play sax parts behind some of the poetry. I can play piano parts. Because some of the songs really were written for specific instruments and not guitar, so I have some pretty neat stuff that can trigger very realistic grand piano sounds and that kind of thing. So I'll do that.
That must be a wonderful feeling. There was one part of my career where I had a partner where I did the writing and he was the photographer, and we kind of edited. I had the editing ideas and we did it together. And when you have a partner in something like that and it clicks, it's really amazing.
It really is amazing.
It's almost like it comes from somewhere else.
You know, that is so perfect that you said that, because that's what I always feel like when we're doing those performances. I feel like it has nothing to do with me. And especially with the improvisation that we get to do. But there'll be the huge PowerPoints of Tom Feelings paintings, and then Kwame is reading. I don't even feel like the music's really coming out of me. At the end, I feel like clapping because I feel like it was somebody else up there doing that.
Have you ever?
Not yet. Not yet. You never know.
You could always clap and face towards him.
that I do, because he is amazing.
He is absolutely amazing. Are you continuing more on the Requiem? Are you still working on Requiem and changing it or performing it elsewhere?
Well, it for me was on the back burner as I've been working on the Shakespeare stuff at this point in my academic career. But I got an email a couple of months ago from Kwame who said, "Are you busy in October?" Well, I think I could make some time. Why? Because I've booked us to play in the Lord Mayor's office in London. So we'll be playing.
So he's not gonna let you rest.
We'll be playing it there. We have some other dates too. We're playing a festival in Harlem, which will be great.
And the thing is also, just about what I've read through, and I haven't heard your music with it, but Kwame's words, you would think that the middle passage would be very sad and tragic, but however, it's also a big story of resilience and hope as well.
It absolutely is a story of resilience and hope, and that's the feeling that you get as you work through Kwame's book. So, and of course then through our performances. So that when he reads the last poem at the end, the poem, I don't remember the exact words, but it starts off with him saying that he didn't know the languages that those people spoke, but he could understand what it was like when after that voyage, then he switches to the second person plural and says, we straightened our backs and went on. So right there's the idea of resilience, there's the idea of having not only had the strength to make that passage, but then the strength to influence culture throughout the African diaspora for centuries to come, which is just amazing to me, just incredible.
It's amazing. Dr. John Carpenter, unfortunately we're out of time. But it's so interesting, and thank you so much. And we're going to have to email Kwame and say, what are you doing? We got something here in Orlando.
Well, it'd be great.
It would be.
Charna, thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Charna Davis Wiese. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on UCF in Print.